Mom and Dad gave me your $800,000 house because soldiers really do not need permanent homes. Brittany raised her crystal wine glass, and the rim caught the light from the dining room chandelier. A chorus of forced laughter followed, led by the sharp, familiar giggle of my mother. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, breathing in the heavy scent of roasted garlic and rosemary from the homecoming dinner they had supposedly thrown in my honor. My fingers brushed the edge of a thick manila folder my father had quietly slid next to my water glass right before the toast. I did not need to open it to know what it was. It was a quitclaim deed. I was 38 years old, and I had just spent 14 months managing military supply chains in Poland as an army major. I knew how to read a battlefield, and this dining room in Colorado Springs was an ambush. I kept my civilian blouse perfectly straight, planted my feet firmly on the rug, and refused to shift in my seat. I let the laughter die out on its own. It took 10 agonizing seconds. Aunt Carol suddenly found her mashed potatoes completely fascinating, and Uncle Jim took a long, slow sip of his Merlot to avoid looking in my direction. One by one, my relatives looked away. Only Brittany kept smiling, holding her glass high like she had just won a prize she had not worked a single day for. "We helped you buy that place 10 years ago," Dad said. He leaned forward and tapped his index finger against the table. "You are always moving around for your deployments, Samantha. You have your housing allowance and your base pay. Your sister is getting married in a few months. She needs a stable foundation to build a family, and it is only right that you return the favor." I looked at the blank manila folder, then back to my father. I kept my expression completely neutral. Who said I agreed? Brittany rolled her eyes and set her glass down hard enough to make the silverware rattle. "Come on, Sam. Everyone knows you will do the right thing eventually. You always fix things for us." She said it with such casual, terrifying confidence. For my entire life, my family had treated my boundaries like mere suggestions, assuming my ingrained sense of duty would eventually override my own needs. They had invited the extended family here tonight to create an audience, believing the public pressure and the shame of making a scene would force my hand. Not today. I reached down into my leather tote bag resting on the floor. The canvas lining inside felt rough against my knuckles. I pulled out my own folder, crisp and white, and extracted 2 documents: the final closing statement and a copy of the newly recorded deed. I slid them slowly across the polished wood, pushing them right over my father's manila envelope. "I sold it last week," I said. The room went completely still, and all you could hear was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Mom lost the color in her face instantly, and her hand dropped heavily into her lap. Without my signature on their prepared paper, my parents had absolutely nothing. Dad snatched up the closing documents, his eyes darting across the dark ink like he could magically find a typo to reverse reality. "This is invalid," Dad announced. He threw the papers back onto the table, his face flushing red. "You are clearly not stable right now. You just got back from a long deployment, and you are acting erratic. We can get this reversed." I kept my voice perfectly level, the exact tone I used when briefing a room full of officers. I had my attorney review the title. We hired an independent appraiser and closed through a licensed agency. The funds have cleared, and the new deed is recorded. The sale is final. Brittany pushed her chair back, and the wooden legs screeched sharply against the hardwood floor. "Are you insane?" she screamed, her carefully curated bride persona completely vanishing. "My furniture is in there. The custom window treatments were delivered yesterday. My entire wedding plan and my future are tied up in that house." My sister had just confessed in front of everyone. She had moved her life into my property before even asking for my permission, confident that this public dinner would serve as a rubber stamp for a theft she had already committed. The front doorbell chimed, cutting through the heavy silence. Brittany gasped, her face flushing with sudden, desperate relief. "That is Owen. He is going to talk some sense into you." She ran toward the foyer, her heels clicking rapidly against the floorboards, ready to fall into her fiancé's arms and play the devastated victim. I stayed in my seat and watched the archway. Owen walked into the dining room a moment later. The man did not reach out to comfort his screaming fiancée. Instead, he stepped right past her, his jaw set tight, and approached the dining table. He carried a dark blue folder with the logo for Mercer Ridge Holdings pressed into the cover. The look in his dark eyes was not the look of a man about to defend his future wife against a cruel sister. It was the look of a man who had just dismantled a bomb. "Tell her she has to cancel it, Owen," Brittany pleaded, grabbing handfuls of his jacket sleeve. "She sold our house." Owen gently but firmly pulled his arm away from her grip. "She sold her house to my company. Mercer Ridge Holdings paid cash for the property last Thursday." He reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out a small velvet ring box, and placed it onto the table. It sat right next to the transfer papers my father had tried to force me to sign. Brittany stared at the velvet box, and her mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. "Before you ask me to save your future," Owen said, his voice deadly quiet, "explain why my lawyer found Samantha's signature copied from a document she signed 4 years ago." Owen dropped the velvet box onto the polished mahogany, and the dull thud echoed perfectly with a memory from 6 months prior. That exact sound matched the security notification that had started everything. It was a cold Tuesday in April, and I was standing inside a massive military supply warehouse near the border of Poland. The air inside the logistics hub smelled of industrial coolant and wet cardboard. The concrete floor sent a steady, dull ache straight up through my heavy combat boots. I had a barcode scanner in my right hand, checking the inventory tags on medical supply crates destined for the field. My phone vibrated deep in my cargo pocket, breaking the rhythmic beep of the scanning machine. I pulled the device out and squinted at the bright screen against the dim warehouse lighting. The notification came from the SmartLock app connected to my house in Colorado Springs. The digital log showed a simple line of text stating the front door had been unlocked. The user was listed as Linda Reed. My breath plumed in the freezing air, and I did the mental math automatically. It was the middle of the afternoon in Poland, which meant it was slightly past 2 in the morning back in Colorado. I stepped away from the pallets, walked over to a quiet corner near the loading dock, and dialed my mother. The line rang 4 times before the connection clicked open. Her voice sounded incredibly groggy, layered with the thick confusion of someone just waking up. She asked what was wrong, and her tone carried genuine surprise. I kept my voice perfectly steady, stripping out any accusation. I simply asked if everything was all right at the house, noting the security alert I had just received. The line went silent for a fraction of a second. Then my mother sighed, explaining that the local news had issued a sudden freeze warning. She claimed she had driven over to leave the faucets dripping so the pipes would not burst, and she apologized for waking me with the system alert. I stared out at the frosted windows of the Polish warehouse. There was no freeze warning in Colorado Springs that week, and my mother hated driving at night more than anything else in the world. She did not mention Brittany. She did not mention anyone else being with her. Instead of pushing the issue and demanding the truth, I told her to drive home safely and ended the call. Then I opened the security application, took a screenshot of the access log, and saved it to a secure drive. That single screenshot felt incredibly heavy, and walking back to the medical crates, my mind started cataloging a decade of similar heavy moments. For years, I believed that stepping in to solve my family's problems was the definitive proof of love. When my father needed emergency surgery and his insurance fell short, I drained my savings to cover the hospital bills. When Brittany lost her apartment lease because she spent her rent money on a designer wardrobe, I let her live in my spare room for 6 months without asking for a dime. I even paid the tuition for her home staging certification, hoping a career would finally stabilize her. Before my first overseas deployment, I handed my mother the spare brass key to my house, believing she would protect my sanctuary. They never viewed those actions as sacrifices. They saw them as expected payments, a natural tax levied on the responsible daughter. 2 years before the Poland assignment, I had stopped paying that tax. I stopped handing out cash, refused to co-sign any more loans, and removed my parents from my emergency banking accounts. I built a separate reserve fund designed to cover a full year of living expenses, drafted a new will, and updated my medical proxy to a trusted Army colleague. My family did not know about the new boundaries, but they certainly felt the sudden lack of open access to my resources. The warehouse shift ended, yet the chill stayed with me all the way back to the barracks. I knew my mother had not gone to check the pipes, but I needed to know exactly what she was hiding. The answer arrived 2 months later, in the middle of June. Summer had finally warmed the Polish countryside, but the digital photograph on my laptop screen made my blood run cold. Mrs. Alvarez, my next-door neighbor back in Colorado, had sent me a message over a secure encrypted app. We had an arrangement. I never asked her to confront anyone or act as a guard dog, but I did ask her to let me know if she saw anything highly unusual. The photograph showed a large, white commercial van parked squarely in my driveway. The side panel displayed the elegant, swirling logo of Brittany's staging company. A man with a professional camera slung over his shoulder was walking up my front steps. Behind him, 2 assistants were carrying massive presentation, mood boards, and a collection of high-end lighting equipment right through my open front door. My sister was not just stopping by to pick up a forgotten sweater. She was treating my property like a professional studio. Mrs. Alvarez asked if I wanted her to walk over and ask them to leave. I typed my reply carefully, feeling the hard plastic keys under my fingertips. I told her to stay exactly where she was, to remain completely unseen, and to just document the dates and times the van appeared. A confrontation would only make Brittany hide her activities better. I needed her to feel confident. That night, I sat at the tiny desk in my quarters and initiated a silent lockdown. I did not use the military servers. I dialed Priya on her private cell phone, outlining the situation with the clinical precision of a supply chain audit. My lawyer listened quietly, her pen scratching against a legal pad on the other side of the world. Following her advice, I called the utility companies first. I added a verbal password to my electric bill, the water account, and the homeowner's insurance policy. I registered with the county clerk for an automated alert system that would ping me if anyone attempted to file a lien or alter the title deed. Then I contacted the smart lock manufacturer directly, upgrading my subscription plan so the system would retain the access logs indefinitely instead of overwriting them every 30 days. On my computer desktop, I created a new digital folder. I named it Home Access. I moved the screenshot of the midnight entry and the photograph from Mrs. Alvarez into the empty space. The trap was set, but I needed to know exactly where my mother stood. I picked up my phone and drafted a text message to Linda. The wording had to be perfectly casual, carrying no hint of suspicion. I wrote that I was updating my insurance files and requested that any changes or movement in the house be communicated to me via text message for the official record. Her reply came through 20 minutes later. The text bubble popped up on my screen, bright green and terribly absolute. She wrote that absolutely nothing was happening. The house was perfectly quiet, and Brittany had not brought a single item inside. I set the phone down next to the laptop. On the glowing monitor, the staging van sat in my driveway, and the photographer was walking through my door. On the phone screen, my mother promised me an empty house. She had willingly locked herself into a documented lie to protect the golden child. I closed my eyes, absorbing the finality of that betrayal, and chose the digital evidence over a screaming argument. The summer dragged into August, and the situation quietly escalated from a violation of privacy into something much darker. The upgraded smart lock application started logging 3 to 4 access events every single week, The entries always showed my mother's specific user code. They happened during normal business hours, right when a staging company would be working. The definitive proof arrived on a Thursday evening. The application pinged my phone with a successful entry alert using Linda's code. I immediately opened a social media application and checked the local Colorado feeds. My mother had just been tagged in a series of live photographs at a charity fundraiser in Denver, over 70 miles away from my front door. She was holding a glass of champagne in a crowded ballroom at the exact second her unique security pin opened my house. She had not simply looked the other way. She had actively surrendered her access privileges, handing the digital keys of my sanctuary directly to my sister. The realization settled heavily into my chest, a cold knot of total clarity. They were not just playing house or using my living room for a quick promotional video. They were preparing for an occupation. The final confirmation arrived right before I went to sleep. An automated security email landed in my personal inbox, sent directly from my residential internet service provider. The subject line glowed in red text, warning of an unrecognized access attempt. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the corporate boilerplate language to find the specific details. A customer service representative noted that an individual had contacted the call center, attempting to transfer the service address and billing name on the account. The caller wanted the internet service legally moved into the name of Brittany Reed. The system automatically blocked the transfer and locked the account because the caller failed to provide the 4-digit security PIN I had established years ago. My sister was not just bringing in mood boards and photographers. She was trying to establish legal residency through utility control. She wanted her name on the bills, creating a paper trail of occupation. She was laying the groundwork to steal my home, and my parents were holding the door wide open for her. I closed the laptop screen, the mechanical click sounding incredibly loud in the quiet barracks. I did not shed a single tear. I just sat in the dark, calculating the exact number of days until my deployment ended, and began planning the sale of the only home I had ever owned. 2 days after the failed attempt to hijack my internet account, my phone buzzed on the metal desk in my quarters. Mrs. Alvarez had sent another encrypted message. This time, my neighbor did not attach a photograph of a staging van. The message contained a single, unlisted video link hosted on a wedding planning website. I clicked the blue text, and the familiar bright lighting of my own kitchen filled the small screen. Brittany stood directly in front of the marble island I had paid to install 5 years ago. She wore a pristine white blazer, looking effortlessly elegant, and held a cup of coffee. The camera operator slowly panned across the living room, capturing the custom staging furniture that had replaced my comfortable worn sofa. "Welcome to our future home," my sister said to the camera, her voice dripping with practiced warmth. "Owen and I are so incredibly blessed to start our marriage in this gorgeous space. We are completely redesigning the interior to reflect our new life together." She gestured toward the bay windows, outlining where a custom dining table would go. The video lasted exactly 3 minutes, and not once did she utter my name. She spoke with the absolute certainty of a property owner giving a guided tour to vendors. The clip was not meant for public consumption on social media, but rather a professional presentation designed to secure catering and floral contracts by projecting immense financial stability. Watching a stranger claim your life piece by piece is a surreal experience, and it required a specific kind of confrontation. I closed the video application and immediately dialed my father. Robert answered on the second ring, his tone booming and cheerful. I bypassed the standard family small talk and asked him directly why my younger sister was recording promotional wedding material inside my house. The cheerful energy vanished from the line, replaced instantly by the stern, authoritative cadence he used whenever I questioned family dynamics. My father let out a long, heavy sigh, acting as if my question was an exhausting inconvenience. "You really do not need to make a mountain out of a molehill, Samantha," he said. "You are thousands of miles away, and that house is just sitting empty. You do not need that much space when you are constantly moving around for the military. Your sister needs a stable foundation right now. I kept my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. It is my house, Dad, not a family timeshare. We made a significant family investment in that property 10 years ago, he countered quickly, his tone sharpening into a weapon. We helped you secure the down payment because we believed in supporting our children. Now, it is your turn to show that same support for Brittany. He was talking about the $20,000 they had loaned me to close the purchase a decade earlier. I did not raise my voice, and I did not remind him of the truth over the phone. I simply ended the call, walked over to my secure footlocker, and pulled out a battered blue cardboard folder. The label on the tab read, Home, written in my own faded handwriting. Inside the heavy cardstock lay the original property deed, bearing only my name. Behind the deed sat 18 perfectly organized bank transfer receipts. Every single piece of paper documented a monthly payment I had made to my parents exactly 10 years ago. The final receipt clearly showed the balance dropping to zero, and the memo line on every single slip read repayment of family loan. My parents did not own a single square inch of my property, yet they had successfully convinced themselves that a long-settled debt somehow granted them permanent moral authority over my assets. They had built a massive delusion, and they were actively feeding my sister to that delusion. That realization triggered a profound shift in my thinking, severing the last lingering thread of familial guilt. Later that same afternoon, an official notification from the Logistics Command arrived in my military inbox. The message outlined my impending transfer to a new stateside duty station upon completion of the Polish deployment. The new base was located several states away from Colorado. Sitting in the glow of the computer monitor, I looked around the austere military quarters. For years, I had held on to the Colorado house as a symbol of stability, a physical anchor proving I had a real life outside the Army. But the anchor had become a chain. The property was no longer a sanctuary. It was a storage unit for my family's entitlement, and a constant drain on my emotional energy. Selling the property was not a sudden act of spite or a vindictive plot to ruin a wedding. It was a strategic extraction. I had been quietly studying for a civilian supply chain management certification for the past year, preparing for the day I would finally hang up my uniform. Liquidating the house would provide the exact capital I needed to fund my civilian transition and purchase a smaller, quieter home far away from my parents. The choice became incredibly clear, and I immediately called my attorney to set the machine in motion. Priya answered her phone with her usual crisp professionalism. I explained my father's comment about the family investment and detailed my decision to sell the property before I returned to American soil. "Let me check the county records right now," the lawyer said, and the sound of rapid typing echoed through the phone speaker. "I want to make absolutely sure no one has attempted to file a fraudulent lien or a quiet title action." 2 minutes of tense silence passed before Priya spoke again. The county records were perfectly clean. The deed remained solely in my name, and the $20,000 loan from a decade ago carried absolutely no legal weight regarding ownership. However, the attorney delivered a firm warning about the items currently sitting in my living room. I could not simply hire a crew to throw Brittany's staging furniture onto the front lawn. Because my sister had brought significant property into the house, destroying or recklessly moving those items could trigger a messy civil lawsuit for damages. Priya advised hiring a licensed third-party property manager to conduct a formal inventory. Every item that did not belong to me would be photographed, sealed, and legally placed into a commercial storage unit at the time of closing. I agreed to the terms, and the next step was finding the right broker. Priya connected me with Elena Martinez, an experienced real estate agent who had previously handled sensitive relocations for several high-ranking military officers. Elena understood the critical need for absolute discretion. She arranged for a private property inspector to visit the house under the guise of routine insurance maintenance, ensuring my mother would not raise any alarms if she checked the security cameras. The appraisal report came back 3 days later. The booming Colorado housing market had pushed the property value to nearly $800,000. Elena advised against putting a sign in the yard or listing the home on public websites. A public listing would instantly alert my family, giving them ample time to sabotage viewings, damage the interior, or file frivolous legal injunctions to stall the process. Instead, the agent utilized a private network of verified investors and corporate buyers who routinely purchased homes for cash without requiring public open houses. The sale moved forward in total silence, hidden entirely behind closed doors and encrypted emails. 5 weeks before my scheduled flight home, a new message popped into my personal email inbox. The sender was Brittany. The subject line simply read "Wedding Logistics," and the tone of the message was sickeningly sweet. My sister wrote about how stressful the planning process had become, complaining about catering costs and floral arrangements. At the very bottom of the long, rambling paragraph, she slipped in a casual request. She asked if I could review and sign a small confirmation document for her wedding planner. Brittany claimed the planner needed a standard statement of family support to finalize the venue layout and delivery schedules. A PDF file was attached to the email. The document was completely vague, lacking any specific legal terminology, but the core message was highly manipulative. The text stated that the undersigned family member fully supported the bride and groom establishing their new household at my specific address. It was not a legally binding quitclaim deed, but it was incredibly dangerous. It was a stepping stone. If I signed that vague paper, my family would use it to publicly claim I had promised them the house, wielding the signature as moral leverage to force the actual transfer later. I did not explode. I did not call her a thief or demand she remove her furniture. I simply hit the reply button and typed a single, decisive sentence. I will review any document with my attorney before signing. The response from Colorado arrived less than 10 minutes later. Completely dropping the sweet bride persona, Brittany fired back a short, furious message. "Why are you making family sound like a legal problem?" I stared at the aggressive question, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over me. She was angry because the usual guilt tactics were failing, and the invisible walls I was building were finally holding firm. I did not reply to her question. I simply forwarded the entire exchange to the Home Access folder, adding another brick to the evidentiary wall. My phone vibrated on the desk, cutting through my thoughts. It was a text message from Priya, and the preview line made my heart beat slightly faster. Elena had just received a formal offer. A corporate buyer had agreed to the asking price and wanted to close the transaction entirely in cash. The buyer demanded a rapid closing timeline, insisting on finalizing the paperwork exactly 7 days before my scheduled family dinner. Furthermore, the purchaser wished to keep their individual identity completely hidden, operating exclusively through a limited liability company named Mercer Ridge Holdings. The timing was perfect, the money was verified, and the secrecy guaranteed my family would remain completely blind until the trap finally snapped shut. The dry autumn air of Colorado hit my lungs the second I stepped out of the airport terminal, tasting like pine needles and high-altitude dust. It felt entirely different from the damp, heavy chill of Eastern Europe. My family believed I was currently sitting in a military processing center in Germany, scheduled to fly home in exactly 8 days. They were busy preparing their ambush for next week. Instead, Lieutenant Colonel Dana Collins stood by the curb next to her dark SUV, leaning against the passenger door. My longtime mentor and friend wore a simple gray sweater instead of her uniform, offering a warm, silent smile as I approached with my duffel bag. We had served together for years, and Dana understood the immense value of a quiet extraction. She did not ask about my parents or mention my sister. She simply opened the trunk, helped me load my heavy gear, and drove me straight to a temporary townhouse she had secured on my behalf. The rental property sat on the quiet side of town, far away from my old neighborhood. Walking inside, the space felt incredibly peaceful. The rooms were mostly empty, featuring only basic furniture and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I dropped my bags onto the woven rug, unzipped the main compartment, and pulled out my laptop along with a small wooden box containing the service medals of a former commander. Setting them on the simple dining table, I took a deep breath. I had a safe place to sleep, a fully funded civilian bank account, and a network of friends who required absolutely nothing from me. My family had no idea this separate life even existed. The next morning required facing the past one final time. Entering my own property felt exactly like breaking into a stranger's life. The brass smart lock accepted my master administrative code with a soft green glow and a heavy mechanical click. Pushing the wooden door open, the first thing that hit me was the smell. My house always smelled like lemon polish and old paper, a comforting scent I had missed for over a year. Now a suffocating wave of artificial vanilla candles and fresh latex paint rolled out of the living room, completely overriding my memories. I stepped into the foyer and stopped dead in my tracks. The wall facing the front window had been patched with 4 different shades of beige paint samples. A massive corkboard rested against the fireplace mantel, completely covered in fabric swatches, floral photographs, and magazine clippings. At the very center of the board, Brittany had pinned a large piece of cardstock. Elegant cursive letters spelled out a single phrase, Brittany and Owen, forever home. The delusion was staggering. My sister had not simply visualized taking my property. She had physically mapped out the hostile takeover, ordering custom window treatments and stacking decorative boxes in the corners of a house she did not own. However, there was no actual mattress in the master bedroom, and the kitchen cabinets remained completely bare. Because she had not moved her clothing or daily living essentials into the space, formal tenancy had not been established. She was just playing interior designer in a stolen sandbox. Priya had coordinated the legal response with ruthless efficiency, ensuring we left no room for civil liability. 2 professionals from a bonded inventory service arrived 30 minutes after I did. They wore gray polo shirts, carried digital tablets, and moved through the rooms with quiet precision. Every single item that did not belong to me was meticulously photographed, cataloged, and wrapped in protective plastic. The crew carefully moved Brittany's staging furniture, the decorative boxes, and the mood board into a moving truck. The property manager would transport everything to a secure, climate-controlled storage facility. A formal notice detailing the unit number and access codes would be mailed to my sister's staging company immediately after the real estate closing. While the inventory crew worked downstairs, I walked into my old home office and packed the last remnants of my history. I pulled my personal tax documents, several thick photo albums, and the faded blue cardboard folder out of the bottom desk drawer. The folder contained every single bank receipt proving I had fully repaid my parents 10 years ago. Slipping the heavy cardstock into my leather tote bag, I ran my fingers over the empty wooden desk. I intentionally left the expensive brass light fixtures and the custom window blinds exactly where they were, as the corporate buyer had agreed to purchase the property precisely as it stood. Locking the front door for the very last time, I did not look back at the empty driveway. The point of no return arrived the following morning inside a downtown office building. The title company occupied the 4th floor, wrapped in thick glass windows that overlooked the mountains. The air conditioning hummed constantly, chilling the massive polished conference table where my real estate agent waited. Elena sat to my right, tapping her expensive pen against a thick stack of printed documents. She nodded quietly as the escrow officer entered the room and distributed the final closing statements. I read every single page, with the exact same focus I used when reviewing military supply contracts. The buyer was officially listed as Mercer Ridge Holdings, a limited liability company registered in Delaware. I did not recognize the corporate name, nor did I care to investigate the holding structure. The escrow officer confirmed the buyer had bypassed all traditional financing. The entire purchase price had already been wired directly into the title company's secure holding account, verified by 3 different banking institutions. Elena pushed the final signature page across the table. Picking up the heavy black pen, I felt a sudden, strange lightness in my chest. Signing my name took less than 3 seconds. The escrow officer stamped the paper confirming the deed would be recorded with the county clerk before the end of the business day. The wire transfer to my secure civilian account was initiated immediately. There was no champagne celebration, and nobody offered a toast. I simply shook Elena's hand, walked out to the parking garage, and drove back to my rented townhouse, feeling the absolute weight of a 10-year burden lifting off my shoulders. I was sitting on the townhouse sofa, drinking black coffee and watching the evening news, when my phone vibrated against the glass coffee table. The caller identification displayed my mother's smiling contact photograph. I let the phone ring 3 times, took a deep breath to steady my pulse, and answered with a perfectly casual greeting. Linda's voice floated through the speaker, pitching slightly higher than normal, completely vibrating with manufactured excitement. She asked if my military flight was still on schedule for next week, probing for any changes to my travel itinerary. I kept my tone light and completely unbothered. I told her the logistics were set and I would see everyone at the scheduled family dinner. "We are just so incredibly excited to have you back," my mother said, the lie rolling off her tongue with terrifying ease. "We have been getting everything ready. Your father and I have a really big surprise planned for the dinner. You are going to be so happy, Samantha." She was actively setting the trap, unaware the jaws had already been removed. I thanked her for the effort, promised to call her when I landed, and ended the connection. Placing the phone face down on the table, I opened my laptop and spent the next 2 hours meticulously dismantling my administrative ties to Colorado Springs. I permanently updated my official mailing address with the post office, routing all future correspondence to a private mailbox out of state. I logged into my military personnel file, deleted my father from the emergency contact registry, and replaced him with Dana. Finally, I canceled the supplementary life insurance policy that listed my mother as the primary beneficiary. The financial and legal separation was now absolute. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place exactly 2 days before the homecoming dinner. I was organizing my civilian transition paperwork when Priya sent an urgent text message requesting I join a secure video conference immediately. Her message stated the legal counsel representing Mercer Ridge Holdings had requested a direct conversation to clarify a critical discrepancy found during their post-closing audit. I set up my laptop on the dining table, adjusted the camera angle, and clicked the encrypted link. Priya appeared in the top corner of the screen, looking incredibly serious inside her law office. A moment later, the main video window expanded to show a modern, brightly lit boardroom. A man in a dark gray suit sat at the head of a massive table, looking directly into the camera lens. It was not a faceless corporate asset manager or an anonymous real estate investor. Owen Mercer, my sister's fiancé, stared back at me. He looked exhausted. The usual easy smile that always defined his presence at family gatherings was completely gone, replaced by a tight, rigid jawline and dark shadows under his eyes. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the boardroom table, and steepled his fingers together. I sat perfectly still, my mind racing through a dozen different possibilities, trying to calculate if this was an elaborate setup orchestrated by my family. But the devastation on Owen's face was too raw, too deeply embedded in his posture to be a performance. He had just bought my house in total secrecy, hiding behind a corporate shell, and now he was looking at me like a man who had just survived a terrible accident. Owen did not offer a polite greeting or engage in small talk. He simply unclasped his hands, reached outside the frame of the camera, and pulled a thick document into view. "Before I explain why I just bought your property," Owen said, his voice completely hollow and devoid of any warmth, "and before we see each other at that dinner on Saturday, you need to see exactly what Brittany told me you had already signed." The screen on my laptop refreshed, and a scanned PDF document filled the entire monitor. Owen sat in his brightly lit boardroom on the other side of the video connection, his face tight with exhaustion. He waited in complete silence while I read the bold text printed at the top of the page: Family Transfer Agreement. I leaned closer to the monitor, scanning the dense legal boilerplate. The text explicitly stated I was willfully surrendering my Colorado property to my sister as a wedding gift upon my return from overseas. At the very bottom of the page, directly under a formal signature line, sat my name. The dark ink looked authentic at a quick glance. The slant and the pressure matched my handwriting perfectly, but a deep, familiar anger settled heavy into my chest. I knew exactly where that specific loop came from. 4 years ago, right before a long deployment, I had signed a temporary medical power of attorney. My ballpoint pen had caught a tiny fiber on the heavy paper, creating a microscopic, jagged smudge on the tail end of the capital letter S. That exact, unique smudge stared back at me from the forged contract. Brittany had literally copied and pasted my old signature onto her fake document, using a 4-year-old template to steal my home. "She told me you considered the property a shared family asset," Owen said. His voice sounded slightly distorted through the computer speakers, entirely stripped of its usual warmth and confidence. "Brittany claimed the title transfer was just delayed because you were stationed in Europe. She even had your parents back her up. Robert sent me an email last month assuring me you would comply with the family decision." My jaw tightened, and I dug my fingernails into the palms of my hands. My family had constructed an entire ecosystem of lies. They used my military service as a convenient excuse for missing paperwork, banking on the fact that I was thousands of miles away and unable to defend my own assets. The businessman rubbed his temple, looking older than his 36 years. He explained that his attorney had initiated a routine asset check while drafting their prenuptial agreement 6 weeks ago. The lawyer pulled the county records and discovered I was the sole owner, completely contradicting everything my sister had promised. Owen did not confront her immediately. He asked his legal team to review the transfer agreement, and their forensic experts spotted the manipulated signature file almost immediately. "My holding company was already looking for rental properties in Colorado Springs," Owen explained, leaning forward in his boardroom chair. "The inspection report came back clean, and the location was a perfect fit for our portfolio. Buying it quietly was the smartest financial investment I could make. It also guaranteed your sister could not use a stolen asset to secure our wedding loans." Priya spoke up from her respective video window, her tone crisp and professional. "My attorney advised both of us to maintain strict legal boundaries. She warned us not to bait Brittany into creating more fake evidence, and she strictly prohibited any hostile communication before the closing was entirely secure." I nodded at the camera, assuring Owen he did not have to pretend to be a happy fiancé for my sake. The man shook his head slowly. He confirmed he was still attending the welcome dinner. Brittany had invited him, and he intended to end the relationship in person, looking her directly in the eye. We agreed on a simple strategy before ending the call. I would only reveal the sale documents if my family attempted to force the property transfer publicly. 2 days later, they walked perfectly into the trap, and the silence in my childhood dining room was absolutely deafening. The scent of roasted garlic had turned sickeningly sweet in the stagnant air. Owen stood near the edge of the mahogany table, right where he had just announced that his holding company owned my house. My sister stood completely frozen by the arched doorway leading to the foyer. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. She stared at the dark blue folder Owen had dropped onto the table, positioned right next to the small velvet ring box. Her practiced, joyful bride persona was dissolving in real time, replaced by sheer panic. Owen did not raise his voice or pace around the room. He simply opened his folder and slid a printed copy of the forged family transfer agreement across the polished wood. "Your sister did not agree to give you anything," Owen said, addressing Brittany but projecting his voice so every relative could hear the accusation. "My lawyer found the original document you pulled this signature from." Aunt Carol gasped audibly from the far end of the table, covering her mouth with her napkin. Brittany swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically toward our mother, desperately searching for a lifeline. Linda looked away instantly. My mother suddenly became intensely interested in the woven placemat, refusing to meet her favorite daughter's gaze. Finding absolutely no support from the matriarch, my sister tried to shift her tactics. "She promised," Brittany stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me from across the room. "Samantha made a verbal promise years ago. The paperwork was just a formality." I leaned forward, resting my forearms heavily on the dining table. "A verbal promise. Tell me the exact date, Brittany. Tell me the room we were sitting in, and name one person who heard me say those words." Silence swallowed the space again. My sister opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. She had no script for an audience that demanded actual facts. My father decided to intervene, desperate to regain control of his collapsing ambush. Robert stood up, pushing his heavy wooden chair back aggressively against the hardwood floor. "Promises within this family do not require dates and witnesses, Samantha," he boomed, attempting to use his usual intimidating volume to shut down the logic. "We all knew you would eventually do the right thing." His defense was a spectacular blunder. I looked up at the man I used to fear and offered a slow, deliberate nod, letting him own his words for a full 3 seconds. "If everyone knew I was going to hand over the house voluntarily," I asked softly, letting the question hang in the air, "why did Brittany need to forge a document to trick Owen into paying for the renovations?" Robert froze, his mouth clamped completely shut. He had just trapped himself in front of the entire extended family. Defending her verbal promise completely destroyed the need for the fake contract resting on the table. He slowly lowered himself back into his chair, defeated by his own argument. Owen turned his attention back to the woman he was supposed to marry. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, unlocked the screen, and read a saved text message aloud. "You sent this to me 3 months ago," Owen stated, his voice devoid of any lingering affection. "You said Samantha does not know about the interior design choices yet, and you wanted to surprise her. If she had already promised you the property, why were you hiding the renovations from the person giving you the gift?" The walls were closing in rapidly, and Brittany resorted to her oldest, most reliable defense mechanism. She burst into tears. Real, heavy sobs echoed through the dining room as she buried her face in her hands. She accused me of plotting this entire scenario just to humiliate her in front of our relatives. She yelled that I had deliberately destroyed her wedding and shattered her future out of pure, bitter jealousy. Owen watched her cry. His expression remained completely flat, utterly unmoved by the emotional display. He did not step forward to offer a tissue or a comforting embrace. "Your future was built on stolen property," he replied softly. The businessman reached out and snapped the velvet ring box shut. The sharp click echoed perfectly in the quiet room. The engagement was officially over. That definitive sound carried 10 times more weight than any screaming argument ever could. My sister stopped crying instantly. The tears vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a sudden vicious anger. She marched toward the table and slammed her hand down hard on the polished wood, rattling the crystal wine glasses. "Fine," Brittany snarled, dropping the victim routine entirely. "Keep your stupid house, but I paid for all of those custom renovations. I paid for the staging furniture, the custom lighting, and the painters. That is my money tied up in that house, and your company is going to write me a check right now to reimburse me." She truly believed she still held leverage. Even as her wedding collapsed in front of an audience, My sister thought she could extract a massive payout from the corporate entity for the materials she had dragged onto my property. Owen did not flinch. He reached into the blue folder one final time and pulled out a single, crisp sheet of paper. It was a printed bank statement from their joint wedding account. He placed the financial record directly beside the closed ring box, smoothing the edges flat with his palm. "Then, explain this," Owen demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Explain the $36,000 that went from our wedding account directly into your staging company over the last 4 months." The dining room fell into a suffocating silence. Brittany stared at the printed bank statement, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dry dock. She had absolutely no explanation for the stolen funds, and her desperate victim routine evaporated under the harsh lighting of the chandelier. My father decided this was the exact moment to reclaim his authority and salvage the collapsing ambush. Robert reached across the table, his thick fingers snatching the manila folder he had strategically placed near my water glass earlier that evening. He slapped the heavy paper down hard in front of me, flipping the cover open to reveal the quitclaim deed he had prepared in secret. "You need to sign this document right now, Samantha," my father ordered, his voice echoing loudly off the dining room walls. "We can still fix this ridiculous mess. You sign the house over to your sister, and Brittany can use the new equity to pay Owen back. We keep everything in the family, and nobody has to involve the authorities." Priya had given me very strict instructions regarding my physical proximity to their legal paperwork. I did not pick up the pen he offered, and I did not reach for the paper. Instead, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, opened the camera application, and took a clear, high-resolution photograph of the filled-out deed resting on the mahogany table. The camera shutter clicked loudly in the quiet room. That digital image proved my father had drafted a formal, legal surrender of my property long before anyone asked for my consent, proving their intent to coerce me. "What exactly are you doing?" Robert demanded, his heavy eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. Before I could formulate an answer, a loud, theatrical sob shattered the tension. My mother pressed her hands against her face, launching into a spectacular display of weeping. "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood?" Linda wailed, looking frantically around the table to gather sympathy from our stunned relatives. "You sold your beautiful house in secret just to humiliate your little sister. You knew she was moving her things inside, and you waited until tonight to destroy her." I watched the tears stream down her carefully powdered cheeks, feeling a profound sense of detachment. "Why did you hide the fact that she was moving things inside?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and calm. My mother dropped her hands instantly, her eyes wide and panicked. "I never let her inside your house. I do not know how she got in there. 2 months ago, I sent you a text message asking if anyone had brought items into the property," I reminded her, watching the remaining color drain completely from her face. "You replied in writing that Brittany had never brought a single thing inside. I did not mention the smart lock data or the security notifications. I simply let her sit with the terrifying realization that her own written lie was now a matter of public record." Robert stepped in to shield his wife, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "We helped you buy that house, Samantha. We gave you $20,000 for the down payment 10 years ago. That makes the property a family investment, and we have a say in what happens to it." The moment I had anticipated for a decade finally arrived. I reached down into my leather tote bag and pulled out the faded blue folder. Opening the heavy cardstock, I removed a thick stack of 18 bank receipts and spread them across the dining table like a casino dealer distributing playing cards. "Every single month for a year and a half, I wired money directly to your checking account," I said, pointing to the highlighted memo lines on the paper slips. "Every single receipt says, 'Repayment of family loan.' The balance was paid in full 9 years ago." Aunt Carol leaned over her plate of untouched mashed potatoes to squint at the closest receipt. She looked up at my father, her expression twisting into a severe frown. "Robert, you bragged to everyone at Thanksgiving that year about Samantha paying off her loan early. You told Jim and me she was completely debt-free." My father opened his mouth, closed it, and stared blankly at the financial receipts. The foundational myth of their entitlement had just evaporated in front of the entire extended family, leaving them with absolutely no moral high ground to stand on. Owen did not wait for another excuse or another lie. The businessman picked up his velvet ring box, gathered his corporate folders, and walked out the front door without looking back. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, officially sealing the end of the ambush. The physical confrontation was over, but the actual war started the following morning. The promised smear campaign launched before I even finished my first cup of coffee on Sunday. Sitting at the small dining table in my rented townhouse, I watched my phone light up with dozens of rapid notifications. Robert had sent a massive group email to every relative and family friend in his extensive address book. The long, rambling message claimed my recent overseas deployment had left me paranoid, selfish, and completely unstable. He wrote that I had experienced a severe mental breakdown and maliciously destroyed my sister's wedding out of pure jealous spite. 10 minutes later, Linda published a vague, highly dramatic post on her public social media page. She mourned the tragic loss of family unity, writing a lengthy paragraph about the profound heartbreak of watching a child choose money over her own blood. I did not type out a furious public response, and I did not engage in the comment section to defend my sanity. Taking steady, measured breaths, I simply took screenshots of every single post and forwarded the images directly to my attorney. Priya drafted a formal cease and desist letter by noon, delivering the warning to my parents via certified email. Whenever a confused relative sent me a text message asking what had happened, I copied and pasted the exact same single-sentence reply. The house was in my name, and it was sold legally. Defending my reputation was a necessary step, but it was not enough. I needed to sever the financial arteries that kept me connected to their endless control. Opening my secure banking application, I navigated to the recurring transfers page. For the last 3 years, I had automatically routed $400 a month to cover the payment for my father's expensive luxury sedan. I clicked the red cancellation button without a second thought. Next, I pulled up the supplemental health insurance policy I had voluntarily funded for my parents, setting the premium coverage to terminate in exactly 30 days. I was not leaving them without basic medical care, but I absolutely refused to continue subsidizing their premium lifestyle while they actively tried to ruin mine. My phone rang less than an hour after the automated cancellation emails hit their inboxes. Linda was practically screaming when I answered the call. "You are punishing us now? You are cutting off your own father's car payment because you threw a tantrum at dinner?" I stared out the townhouse window at the quiet, tree-lined street. "This is not a punishment, Mom. This is the end of a subsidy. I am simply no longer paying for the privilege of being treated like an unlimited bank account." I ended the call and blocked her number for the rest of the weekend, assuming I had uncovered the worst of their betrayal. Priya's afternoon update quickly proved how wrong I was. The lawyer requested a secure phone call late Sunday afternoon, and she sounded highly energized, adopting the distinct tone she always used when a legal strategy perfectly aligned. The manufacturer of my smart lock system had finally delivered the complete, unedited access logs we requested several weeks ago. My attorney had spent her entire morning cross-referencing the digital timestamps with my mother's public social media timeline. "Your mother did not just hand over her code once," Priya explained, the sound of rustling paper coming clearly through the speaker. "The system recorded Linda's unique PIN number, opening your front door on September 14th. Linda was tagged in dozens of photographs at a charity auction in Denver that entire evening. She physically could not have been the person unlocking your house." The digital evidence completely dismantled Linda's claim of ignorance. She had willfully surrendered her security credentials to Brittany, knowing exactly what her youngest daughter intended to do with the access. "It gets worse," Priya added, her voice dropping a full octave. "My attorney had subpoenaed the cloud storage records for the doorbell camera attached to my property. Most of the archived footage showed delivery drivers and staging assistants carrying heavy boxes. But one specific video clip, recorded 3 weeks before my return, captured Brittany arguing with a custom furniture vendor on the front porch. The vendor had politely asked for the homeowner's signature on a delivery manifest. Brittany's voice came through the camera microphone, sounding sharp, arrogant, and incredibly annoyed. She told the delivery driver not to worry about the actual owner. My sister looked directly into the camera lens and stated clearly that her sister would not be coming back here. The air in my rented living room suddenly felt dense and hard to breathe. Brittany was not just planning a temporary occupation while I was deployed. She genuinely believed she could lock me out of my own life permanently, erasing my existence to build her own. Priya paused for a moment, letting the heavy weight of the video transcript sink in. "This is no longer a simple family misunderstanding, Samantha. It is concrete evidence of intent, and we are handing all of it over to the authorities." The financial web Brittany spun around Owen started to unravel on a rainy Tuesday morning in a cramped conference room. I sat across from Owen's attorney, watching a large television screen display a meticulously color-coded spreadsheet. Every single line item represented a betrayal of trust, a calculated drain on a wedding account that had been intended for a shared future. Owen sat beside me, his eyes fixed on the display with a cold, analytical focus. He had finally opened his financial records to a thorough investigation, and the damage was far worse than we initially suspected. We sorted the expenditures into 3 distinct categories. The first column listed items Owen explicitly approved, such as floral arrangements and venue deposits. The second column contained personal purchases Brittany had made without his authorization, including high-end luggage and luxury spa treatments. The third, and most damning, contained payments routed directly into her staging company bank account. One specific transaction stood out from the rest. Brittany had invoiced an exorbitant amount for a set of velvet sofas she claimed were essential for staging the living room. Owen checked the invoice against the original supplier quotes and realized she had inflated the price by over $3,000. She essentially forced her fiancé to pay for her own business inventory while pretending it was a housewarming upgrade for our property. "She charged him for her own equipment," I whispered, the absurdity of the greed finally sinking in. The lawyer nodded, his pen scratching notes on a yellow legal pad. "It is a textbook example of wire fraud, Samantha. She utilized his money to build her private assets under the guise of wedding planning." We contacted several vendors who had worked on the staging projects throughout that summer. A furniture supplier forwarded a lengthy email thread where my sister insisted the homeowner had already signed a transfer deed. Another contractor provided a voicemail recording where Brittany assured him Owen had approved every single expense, even though the man had never seen the inflated bills before they were paid. Each voice message and email string acted as a new nail in her legal coffin. I felt a strange sense of relief watching the evidence pile up. I had spent so much of my life protecting her from the consequences of her own choices, but now the paper trail was doing the work for me. Brittany realized the trap was tightening by the end of that week. She sent a frantic text to our mother, screaming that I was destroying her livelihood and demanding that Linda find a way to intervene. Our mother forwarded the frantic message to me, perhaps hoping I would be swayed by the panic. Instead of replying, I sent the entire screenshot chain to my attorney. By Friday, our legal team had enough material to construct a formal, airtight file. We engaged a forensic expert to analyze the metadata of the fake transfer agreement. He confirmed the file originated on a laptop registered to Brittany's business account. Even worse, The backup history of her cloud server proved she had renamed a file from an original folder labeled as a signature sample into the final signed transfer document. She kept a digital trail of the forgery, the forensic expert noted, pointing to the timestamps on the screen. She literally labeled the evidence of her own crime. Priya walked me through the final, difficult step of the process. We were moving past simple, civil disputes into the realm of criminal investigations. I stared at the formal report on the desk. This document detailed the forged signatures, the fraudulent invoices, and the illicit access to my home. We are officially delivering these reports to the Economic Crimes Unit of the local police, Priya explained, her voice steady and professional. They need to know about the wire fraud and the forgery. Once they review this, they will want to speak with the parties involved. Are you ready to provide your official statement? I looked at the thick stack of papers, realizing this was the moment I finally stopped saving my sister from herself. I reached for the pen and signed my name on the bottom of the complaint. I am ready, I said, and for the first time in years, the answer felt entirely true. Linda invited me to meet at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town, promising a chance to mend the fractured family dynamic. The small cafe smelled of burnt espresso and rainy pavement, a far cry from the pristine, manicured atmosphere of my old home. I sat in a corner booth, watching my mother nervously twist her wedding ring while she pleaded for a resolution. She suggested that if I personally asked Owen to withdraw the criminal reports, Brittany would be willing to offer a heartfelt apology for the misunderstanding. I stared at the woman across from me, looking for any shred of genuine remorse. I asked if my sister intended to return the stolen funds or officially admit to forging my signature on the transfer agreement. Linda merely sighed, her expression hardening into a familiar mask of defensive exhaustion. She told me Brittany had simply been panicked by the mounting wedding expenses and made a momentary error in judgment. The total lack of accountability felt like a punch to the stomach. My mother was still operating under the assumption that I existed primarily to absorb the consequences of my sister's actions. I realized then that my parents viewed the entire criminal investigation as an unfortunate, avoidable inconvenience rather than a response to a series of calculated, illegal choices. 3 days later, I sat in a sterile, windowless conference room for my official deposition. The air conditioning hummed with a low, mechanical drone that made my skin itch. I wore a simple navy blazer and kept my hands folded on the table, offering testimony with the same objective precision I had used during my military service. I detailed the timeline of the unauthorized property entries, the forged signature I discovered, and the pattern of financial exploitation Brittany had orchestrated using Owen's accounts. I did not raise my voice, and I did not let my emotions dictate the pacing of my answers. My testimony relied strictly on the facts, the dates, and the physical records I had spent months curating. When my father's turn arrived, the atmosphere in the room grew significantly colder. Robert sat in the same chair I had occupied, sweating through his shirt while the prosecutor laid out a timeline of his involvement. He claimed he truly believed I had given Brittany verbal permission to take over the property, insisting that such arrangements were common within our family culture. The prosecutor pulled a folded sheet of paper from a file and laid it on the table. It was the frantic text message Linda had sent to Brittany before the homecoming dinner. I watched the projection of the screen as the lawyer read the words aloud. "Do not tell Samantha before dinner. She will say no if she has time to think." If Samantha had already given her verbal permission, "Mr. Reed," the prosecutor asked, his voice cutting through the heavy tension like a blade, "why was your wife so terrified of letting her think about the transition?" My father sat in total silence for a long time. The only sound in the room was the clicking of a radiator near the floor. He eventually slouched, the bravado that usually fueled his entitlement completely draining away. "She did not agree," he finally admitted, his voice barely audible. "We expected her to." Hearing those words spoken aloud finally broke the last, lingering tether of my childhood conditioning. I had spent 38 years operating under the crushing weight of that specific expectation, assuming my compliance was a mandatory tax for my parents' affection. They had never asked for my consent. They simply calculated the precise amount of pressure and emotional manipulation required to force my submission. The legal proceedings dragged on through the winter, slowly grinding the family structure into dust. Brittany eventually contacted my lawyer through her own legal counsel, desperately trying to redirect the blame onto our parents. She claimed that my father had promised the house would be hers, framing herself as the ultimate victim of their bad advice and unrealistic pressure. It was the final, pathetic act of a dying strategy, shifting responsibility to whoever happened to be standing in the line of fire. The prosecutor eventually offered a plea agreement, noting that the mountain of digital evidence made a conviction almost inevitable if the case went to trial. The offer required Brittany to accept full legal responsibility for the forgery and the financial fraud. She would face 4 months in a county facility, 3 years of strict, supervised probation, and a significant court-ordered restitution plan to pay back the funds she had pilfered from Owen's accounts. Before the judge officially stamped the agreement, my sister's lawyer reached out with one final, bizarre demand. Brittany requested a private, face-to-face meeting with me, claiming she needed closure before accepting the plea deal. I agreed to the meeting, primarily because I wanted the record to reflect I had given her every opportunity to face the truth. We sat in a sterile office, the glass partitions creating a physical barrier between us. Brittany did not lead with a confession or a plea for mercy. She sat across from me and immediately began rattling off a list of grievances regarding her damaged professional reputation, the cost of her legal fees, and the impending loss of her business clients. "You have the money from the house sale, Samantha," she whispered, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate intensity. "You can easily pay for my lawyers and settle the restitution. If you would just fix this, the judge would go easy on me." I watched her, realizing she still perceived our entire relationship through the lens of a transaction. My sister was standing on the edge of a criminal conviction, facing months of incarceration, yet her primary goal was still securing access to my resources. "Do you believe the house was ever yours?" I asked. She avoided my gaze, staring instead at her own trembling fingers. "Mom and Dad said it would be." "I am not paying for your lawyers, Brittany," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of malice. "I already fixed what belonged to me. The rest of this mess belongs entirely to you." The judge accepted the plea agreement the following week. Standing in the courtroom, I delivered a brief impact statement. I did not ask for the maximum possible sentence, nor did I demand my sister suffer for my amusement. I simply looked at the judge and explained that the most significant damage was not the property itself, but the lifelong assumption that my consent was merely an obstacle to be bypassed by family. Brittany stared at the floor throughout the entire hearing, her expression unreadable. Outside the courthouse, the wind whipped through the trees, biting and cold. My phone chirped in my pocket, displaying a missed call from my mother. I didn't return it. I knew exactly what she was going to say, just as I knew I would never be the person she needed me to be again. Brittany entered the county facility on a gray, overcast Tuesday morning, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely no compulsion to intercede. The preceding months had been an exhausting process of documentation, depositions, and legal maneuvers that systematically dismantled my family's power. I stood in the parking lot of the Justice Center, watching the heavy metal gate close behind her, and realized the silence in my life was no longer a void. It was a recovery. The restitution plan mandated by the court arrived in a thick envelope shortly after her sentencing. It detailed a monthly payment structure designed to ensure Brittany repaid every cent she had extracted from Owen's accounts during her staging business venture. She was also explicitly prohibited from managing any company financial accounts during her 3-year probationary period. The business she had prioritized over our relationship lay in total ruins, its assets liquidated to satisfy the initial court judgments. My own life began to stabilize into a rhythm I had never truly experienced as an adult. With the house sold, the legal battles mostly behind me, and my military career approaching its final phase, I felt a strange, quiet space opening up where my anxiety used to reside. I didn't rush to fill it. Instead, I spent my weekends reading at the local library, running on trails that wound deep into the woods, and focusing entirely on the transition to my new civilian career. My parents remained a distant, echoing frequency in my life. The fallout from the court hearing had rippled through the extended family, leaving a permanent scar on our reputation. Robert and Linda no longer occupied the center of family gatherings, primarily because they could no longer rely on me to bridge the gap between their actions and reality. Aunt Carol eventually called me to admit that she and several other relatives had felt foolish for believing my father's lies for so long. They had mistaken my stoic silence for complicity, assuming I was happy to pay for the family's mistakes. Hearing those words didn't bring me joy, but it finally grounded the truth in external reality. I wasn't the broken daughter they had painted in their smear campaign. I was simply the one who had finally walked away from a rigged game. Robert eventually sold his luxury sedan, the one I had stopped subsidizing months before, and traded it for a sensible, older model that didn't demand a hefty monthly payment. Linda had started seeing a therapist to deal with what she termed the sudden, tragic fracturing of her family unit. Though my attorney's reports indicated she still spoke about the situation as if it were a natural disaster I had personally invited upon them. I checked my mailbox on a crisp spring afternoon and found a thick, heavy envelope addressed in my sister's familiar loopy handwriting. I didn't open it immediately. I set the letter on the kitchen island and walked away, making a cup of tea, letting the steam curl into the air while I considered whether I even wanted the correspondence. The letter had been sent from the facility, and I knew its contents would likely be another attempt at persuasion. I opened the seal, my hands steady, and pulled out a single sheet of lined paper. Brittany's writing was frantic, with ink smudges where she had pressed the pen too hard against the page. She wrote about the isolation of her situation, the harshness of the facility guards, and the humiliating simplicity of the daily routine. For the first time, she explicitly admitted to forging my signature on the transfer agreement, using the word forgery without any qualifying adjectives or excuses. She also confessed to moving the staging furniture into my house, admitting she knew exactly how wrong it was at the time, but claiming she felt entitled because she was the one getting married. The letter wasn't a sudden, miraculous transformation into a person of character. It was a strategic plea for sympathy, likely hoping that, by finally stating the facts, she could leverage my history of saving her into a reduction of her sentence or a lessening of the restitution payments. I sat at my dining table for nearly an hour, reading the confession over and over until the words lost their sharpness. I felt the old pull of sympathy, the deeply ingrained reflex to reach out and pull her from the fire, but I consciously suppressed it. Acknowledging her guilt was not the same thing as offering an absolution that would erase the consequences she had earned. I decided not to reply. Not then, and not in the weeks that followed. The silence was the most honest response I could offer. Owen had moved on in his own way, managing my old house as a high-end rental property. He had made it clear during the deposition that he viewed the entire episode as a necessary education in vetting his own blind spots. We didn't keep in touch, though I occasionally saw his holding company name listed on regional real estate forums. He had survived the betrayal with his finances intact and his priorities redefined, which was the best outcome either of us could have expected from the wreckage. I found myself wondering during those long, quiet nights in my new townhouse if my sister was capable of ever learning how to be a person who didn't view others as assets. The letter she sent was a start, perhaps, but it was just a start. The damage she had caused wasn't just financial, and it couldn't be repaired by a 4-month stint in a county unit. It required an internal restructuring that Brittany hadn't shown the slightest interest in pursuing. The following month, Dana and Elena visited me for a casual dinner. They didn't ask about the trial, the facility, or the state of my parents' marriage. They were simply there, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about the upcoming summer transition. "You look different, Sam," Elena noted, leaning back in her chair with a glass of Pinot Noir. "You look like you're actually breathing again." I thought about the house in Colorado, the mood board on the fireplace mantel, and the way my mother's voice used to make my stomach tighten with anticipation. "I think I was holding my breath for about 10 years, I replied, watching the sunlight fade across the living room floor. It was true. My entire adult identity had been defined by my capacity to serve as the structural support for a family that didn't know how to stand on its own. Every decision I made, every dollar I earned, and every boundary I tried to build had been filtered through the lens of what my parents would demand and what my sister would claim. I had been playing the role of the reliable, disposable anchor for so long that I forgot I was an entire person, capable of drifting away from the shore whenever I pleased. The final court report regarding the restitution plan arrived in my mailbox in late June. Brittany had been assigned a strict payment schedule, and my attorney confirmed the first installment had already been processed from the remaining assets of her liquidated business. The legal loop was closing. I took the thick folder containing all the court documents, the forged contracts, the access logs, the metadata reports, and the correspondence and filed it away into a deep, dark cabinet in my spare bedroom. I wouldn't be checking those files again. They were archives of a battle that was officially over, historical records of a version of myself I no longer needed to inhabit. Linda called me once more, shortly after the final judgment was published in the local paper. She was calm, which was usually the precursor to a particularly difficult conversation. She didn't scream this time. She simply informed me that my father had stopped talking about the house entirely, as if the entire decade-long saga had been a fever dream. "He wants to pretend it didn't happen," my mother said, her voice sounding thin and brittle. "He thinks if we don't speak the names, the shame will just vanish." "The shame doesn't vanish, Mom," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It just gets buried, and burying it doesn't change the fact that you still have the keys and you still have the history." "I just want us to be a family again," she pleaded, a desperate, fading echo of the woman who used to manipulate me with ease. "I am a family," I said, thinking of Dana, Elena, and the colleagues who respected my boundaries without needing a court order. "I am just not the one you want me to be." I hung up the phone and walked to the window. The trees outside were lush and full, swaying in the gentle breeze. My life was finally my own, defined not by the needs of others, but by the quiet peace I had cultivated in the vacuum they left behind. I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't be attending the next family dinner. I wouldn't be flying back to the suburbs to be the reliable, silent donor for my parents' retirement or my sister's next grand, poorly conceived scheme. For the first time in my life, I understood that I didn't need to be the one to bridge the gap. I had built my own bridge, and I was on the other side, alone but entirely whole. The isolation I once feared had transformed into a profound sense of sovereignty. I had survived the homecoming, survived the ambush, and emerged from the wreckage without needing to save anyone but myself. I finished my tea and stood up, feeling a steady, calm strength in my legs. The past didn't possess me anymore. It was just a story I had once lived through, a chapter I had successfully closed. I turned off the kitchen light, walked into the living room, and looked around at the modest, quiet space I had worked so hard to create. It was clean, it was mine, and for the first time in years, it was completely, blissfully silent. I realized, as I settled into bed, that the fear of losing their love had been a phantom all along. They never loved me, not in the way I had needed. They loved the utility I provided, the safety net I acted as, and the bank account I maintained for their convenience. Once the utility was gone, once the safety net was withdrawn, the affection vanished with it. It was a cold, harsh revelation, but it was also a liberation. I didn't have to carry the burden of their expectations, because their expectations were based on a person who didn't exist. I was not the military sister who would always say yes. I was not the endless provider who would pay for their mistakes. I was simply Samantha, and for the first time, that was enough. The dawn was starting to bleed purple across the horizon as I finally drifted into a deep, uninterrupted sleep. I didn't dream about the house in Colorado. I didn't dream about the staging furniture or the forged contracts. I dreamed of a wide, open road, and for the first time in my life, I was the only one in the driver's seat. The map was mine, the destination was mine, and the silence was the greatest gift I had ever received. My sister was behind bars, my parents were in therapy, and I was finally truly free. The narrative they had written for me had been rewritten, edited into something unrecognizable, and I was the final author. I woke up the next morning feeling lighter, as if the air itself had become easier to inhale. I made a fresh girly stepped out, us please, private balcony, and watched the world wake up without an ambush waiting for me. Everything I had ever truly needed was already right here, in my hands, under my own roof, and I knew that no one would ever take that away from me again. I closed my eyes and leaned against the railing, feeling the warmth of the early morning sun on my face. The homecoming was complete, and I had returned to the only place that truly mattered, to myself. The long shadow of the family drama finally retreated into the past, leaving behind a clear, unencumbered horizon. I wouldn't be looking back. There was nothing left to see, nothing left to fix, and nothing left to prove to the people who had spent my entire life trying to make me disappear. I turned away from the railing and walked back inside, ready for a day that held no obligations to anyone but myself. And that, I realized, was how the story was supposed to end. The air in my townhouse felt different this morning, stripped of the heavy, lingering tension that had defined my life for over a year. October of 2026 had arrived, bringing a sharp, crisp autumn breeze that rattled the dry leaves outside my bedroom window. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the cool floorboards against my feet, and looked at the small wooden box sitting on the dresser. Inside lay the worn, brass key I had handed to my mother before my first overseas deployment, a piece of metal that had once represented my trust. I hadn't returned it, nor had I thrown it away. It rested there as a quiet monument to a version of myself that no longer existed. My new life was smaller, quieter, and fundamentally my own. I had moved into a modest home near the local library, a place where the floorboards creaked in predictable ways and the neighborhood children played on the sidewalk until dusk. Every single piece of furniture had been chosen by me, for me, and paid for with the proceeds of a life I had built on my own terms. The restitution payments from the court arrived like clockwork, serving as a dull, monthly reminder of the judicial resolution. Brittany had served her time in the county unit and was now navigating the difficult, low-paying reality of a life with a criminal record. Her staging company was long gone, the assets sold off to satisfy the civil judgments, and the grand, curated future she had envisioned had evaporated. She had sent another letter 2 weeks ago, a thin envelope that looked much less frantic than the one from the facility. I still hadn't opened it. It rested at the bottom of a drawer in the spare bedroom, and for the moment, that was exactly where it belonged. My parents lived in a state of carefully cultivated amnesia. They hadn't reached out in months, and the silence had become a comfortable, protective barrier. Occasionally, a relative would mention hearing that my father was struggling to or that my mother was still attending therapy sessions to process the supposed tragedy of our family rupture. I didn't feel the sharp, agonizing pang of guilt I once feared. Their struggle was the consequence of their own choices, not the result of my decision to finally stop bankrolling their reality. I had stopped acting as the structural support for a house built on sand, and the fact that it was collapsing was not my responsibility to address. Dana, Elena, and Priya arrived at my house that evening for a small dinner. There were no elaborate preparations and no pressure to perform. We ate simple food, drank a bottle of wine, and laughed about work projects that didn't involve soldiers or supply chains. Nobody looked at me with pity or expectation. Nobody asked me to fix a crisis they had created, and nobody expected me to sacrifice my peace to preserve their public reputation. When the last guest departed, the quiet returned to the living room, settling over the space like a soft, warm blanket. I stood in the middle of the room, listening to the hum of the world outside, and thought about the woman I used to be. That woman had spent decades terrified that if she stopped giving, stopped paying, or stopped protecting, the people she loved would simply evaporate. She had been wrong. They didn't evaporate. They just lost their leverage. I walked to the kitchen, turned off the light, and paused to look at the single set of keys resting on the granite counter. One key for the front door, one for the mailbox, and nothing else. There was no backup, no emergency cash, and no shared access. My home was a sanctuary, a place where my no was treated as a complete, undeniable sentence. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to apologize for my existence, and I didn't need to provide a justification for the boundaries I had set. Walking back into the living room, I noticed the moonlight streaming through the large windows, casting long, silver shadows across the floor. I thought about the house in Colorado Springs, the $800,000 monument to my family's entitlement, and wondered if the current renters liked the way the light hit the kitchen island in the mornings. It didn't matter. The house was just a structure, a collection of wood and nails that had served its purpose as a battleground. My home was here, in the silence, in the safety, and in the person I had fought to become. My sister's final letter remained sealed in the spare bedroom, a relic of a past that had lost its power to hurt me. I didn't need the apology she likely offered, and I didn't need the closure she was seeking. I had found my own closure in the act of walking away, in the act of surviving the ambush, and in the profound, steady discovery that I was enough on my own. I laid down on the sofa, feeling the heavy, beautiful absence of the burden I had carried since childhood. For the first time in my life, nobody had a key to my home because they believed they were entitled to one. The only person holding it was me. Everything about this reality felt sustainable. There was no looming disaster to manage, no looming bankruptcy to bail out, and no looming confrontation to rehearse in the shower. There was only the steady, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the gentle movement of the curtains in the breeze. My sister was working minimum wage jobs to satisfy a court order, and my parents were finally realizing that their influence had a finite limit. I had moved past the stage of needing to be the victim, the savior, or the villain in their messy little drama. I was just Samantha, a person with a job, a home, and a future that felt completely open, wide, and entirely mine. The exhaustion that had haunted me since the homecoming dinner finally receded, leaving behind a clear, sharp sense of purpose. I had successfully navigated the most dangerous, treacherous period of my life, not by fighting fire with fire, but by simply refusing to provide the fuel. I hadn't set out to destroy them. I had only set out to save myself, and in doing so, I had forced them to exist within the boundaries of their own reality for the first time. They were now responsible for the world they had created, and I was finally free to inhabit the world I had chosen to build. I got up from the sofa and walked to the hallway, looking at the photos I had chosen to display. There were no pictures of my parents or Brittany. Every frame represented a relationship based on mutual respect, not based on leverage. I smiled at the faces looking back at me, knowing I was finally surrounded by people who would never ask me to sacrifice my stability for their convenience. Turning toward the bedroom, I felt a deep, profound sense of gratitude for the woman I had been in those final difficult months. I had been terrified of the public fallout, terrified of the accusations of selfishness, and terrified of the potential for things to go wrong. Yet, I had stayed the course. I had chosen to be the villain in their story, so that I could finally be the protagonist in my own. I had chosen to be the one who didn't save them, and in that refusal, I had discovered the full, unadulterated depth of my own potential. The night deepened, the house settling into the comfortable, familiar noises of a structure resting for the night. I climbed into bed, feeling the weight of the sheets and the cool surface of the pillow. Tomorrow would be another day of progress, of growth, and of living in the light of my own decisions. I wouldn't be checking my smart lock logs in the middle of the night anymore. I wouldn't be worrying about the names on the internet bills, or wondering what my mother was saying about me to the extended family. The story had reached its final, logical conclusion. The characters had played their roles, the evidence had been examined, and the truth had been recorded. I didn't need to know if Brittany would ever truly change, and I didn't need to wonder if my father would ever sincerely repent. Their evolution was their own burden to carry, a project for their own private, internal investigation. My project was finished, my sanctuary was secured, and my future was as wide and as bright as the morning sun would be in just a few hours. Closing my eyes, I let the last vestiges of the past dissolve. The house in Colorado Springs was gone, the wedding was an empty, failed event, and the family ties had been severed with surgical, legal precision. I felt the slow, steady pull of sleep, a deep, restorative darkness that held no fear for me. I was safe, I was whole, and I was entirely in control of the space I occupied. The homecoming had been long, brutal, and fraught with deception, but I had finally arrived exactly where I was meant to be. I took one last, slow breath, tasting the clean, crisp air of my own life. There were no ghosts waiting in the corners, and no secrets waiting to be unearthed by a forensic team. Everything was out in the open, everything was accounted for, and everything was right. I felt the transition into sleep, a gentle, quiet slide into rest, knowing that when I woke up tomorrow, the only person waiting to greet me would be the woman I had fought to become. It was a beautiful, terrifying, and utterly perfect end to the long, long road home. You have reached the end of this journey, but your own path toward peace is just beginning. Never forget that a home is not defined by who has a key, but by who respects your right to say no. True boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are the essential blueprints for self-preservation that protect your mental and emotional integrity from those who would drain you. If you recognize a pattern of exploitation in your own life, understand that your compliance is not a mandatory tax for love, and choosing to walk away is the most powerful tool you have to reclaim your sovereignty. You do not have to be the martyr in someone else's story to prove your worth, because you are already enough, exactly as you are, without performing constant, self-sacrificing labor for others. Ask yourself this: if you stopped being the reliable anchor for those who take without asking, would they still hold space for you, or would they simply drift away to find another resource? You deserve to be surrounded by people who respect your peace, and it is time to start building the life you were always meant to inhabit.